When we think about motivation, true, sustained, deep motivation, we have to begin with the brain's chemistry. And at the center of that is dopamine. Most people misunderstand what dopamine really is. They think of it as the molecule of pleasure. That's inaccurate. Dopamine is the molecule of desire, of drive, of motivation and pursuit. It is what gets you to move towards something that you perceive as valuable. And the key word here is perceive. The brain doesn't release dopamine simply because you achieve something. It releases dopamine because you believe you're moving towards something meaningful. Now, what happens when you tell people what you do or what you're planning to do? Neuroscientifically speaking, the moment you express your goals, say them out loud, share them online, or even mention them casually at dinner, you receive a hit of dopamine. But here's the twist. That dopamine isn't being released because you're progressing. It's being released because you've created the illusion of progress. You feel seen, you feel acknowledged, you feel socially rewarded. And your brain, which is wired for survival and energy conservation, mistakes that validation as a sign that the work is already in motion, or worse, that it's complete. This is one of the reasons why people plateau, why they get stuck, because the brain has been satisfied prematurely. It has already cashed in on the reward before any real concrete action has been taken. This is called goal substitution. In research psychology, this phenomenon shows up when individuals who talk about their intentions are statistically less likely to follow through on them. The explanation? Talking mimics doing at the level of brain chemistry. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and decision-making, and your striatum, which governs reward processing, essentially go offline or down-regulate activity once dopamine is spiked through verbal affirmation or praise. Let's go deeper. The dopamine system is incredibly plastic. That means it changes based on how you use it. If you consistently get dopamine from external sources, likes, praise, approval, validation, your brain begins to build a dependency on that loop. It stops associating effort and grind and consistency with reward. Instead, it links reward with exposure. That's dangerous because now, instead of being pulled toward mastery or meaning, you're pulled toward attention. You've rewired your motivational architecture to be externally governed. That's the fastest way to destroy long-term fulfillment. Internal rewards, on the other hand, are different. When you attach dopamine to small wins, to personal rituals, to the process, you build something called autonomous motivation. That's the kind of motivation that doesn't fade when people stop clapping. It doesn't collapse when no one's watching. It's self-generated, self-contained, and incredibly powerful. You begin to crave the work, not the praise. You chase the reps, not the recognition. And the brain, through repeated reinforcement, learns to love the burn, the silence, the early mornings, the solitude, the imperfection of progress. That's where elite performance comes from. One of the most effective practices in neuroscience for increasing intrinsic motivation is reward prediction error. That means you expect a reward from doing the work, not from showing the work. The unexpected payoff of simply pushing through a hard workout or finishing a difficult task or studying when you didn't feel like it, those unexpected surges of satisfaction build internal dopamine loops. But if you leak that intention out early, if you tell someone what you plan to do, your brain front loads that dopamine and you weaken the prediction error mechanism. You trick your system into thinking you're progressing when all you've done is talk. And this is why silence is not just strategy, it's biochemistry. When you withhold your goals, you preserve the dopamine for the actual effort. When you stop announcing your next move, you allow the brain to attach meaning to the pursuit itself rather than the perception of pursuit. You protect your motivation from being hijacked by external metrics. This doesn't mean you avoid feedback or isolate yourself. It means you train your brain to derive energy from doing, not declare. You said talking triggers the brain's completion mechanism. Expand it up to minimum 600 words and do not add any ending sentence. There's a powerful mechanism in the human brain known as the completion reward loop. It's a neurological system designed to reinforce behaviors that help us survive and thrive by releasing neurochemicals when we finish something meaningful. The key player in this system is dopamine, but not just dopamine in isolation. This process also involves the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and executive function, and the limbic system, which governs emotion and memory. When these areas work in harmony, they can drive intense focus and persistence. But here's the paradox. Simply talking about your goals can hijack this entire process. Your brain doesn't necessarily distinguish between doing something and describing it in great detail. When you talk about what you're going to do, when you paint the picture for someone else, outline your next steps, or articulate your ambitions with emotion and clarity, your brain activates neural circuits similar to those involved in actual execution. In other words, when you speak your intentions out loud, your brain starts to believe the task is already complete. And as a result, it starts to shut down the very drive you need to actually follow through. This is known in psychology as the intention-behavior gap. Studies show that when individuals share their goals publicly or speak about them too early, they are less likely to act on them. Why? Because the brain, having felt the emotional satisfaction of acknowledgement, mistakenly concludes that the job is done. It closes the loop prematurely. You feel good, you feel seen, you feel accomplished, but nothing has actually changed. You haven't moved the needle. You've just talked about moving the needle. From a neuroscience perspective, this is not a minor issue. Talking can be a form of dopamine leakage, a premature release of the very neurochemical you need to stay focused and motivated. Every time you articulate your future goals with intensity, your brain gives you a small dose of the reward you were supposed to earn after the action. Over time, this reduces your baseline motivation. It trains your system to seek validation through communication rather than transformation. And once that loop is set, it's hard to reverse because it feels productive. It feels like you're taking control. But biologically, you're just playing tricks on your reward circuitry. Let's break this down even further. The reticular activating system, network of neurons in your brainstem, helps determine what you focus on. When you think about a goal silently, it activates in a low noise, high efficiency mode. You process the idea, visualize the outcome, and build internal focus. But when you verbalize that same goal to others, especially with emotional expression, your RAS begins to mark it as processed, as something that's already received attention. And in doing so, it deprioritizes the action phase. The energy starts to drop, the urgency fades, because your brain isn't wired for optics, it's wired for efficiency. And when it thinks the mission is done, it wants to conserve energy, not spend it. This is why high performers, those who operate at the edge of mastery, rarely broadcast what they're building. It's not out of arrogance or secrecy. It's because they understand the neurobiology of momentum. They know that the brain needs friction, not applause. Tension, not approval. Progress requires mental pressure. When you keep your goals inside, when you sit with them, iterate on them, work on them in silence, you maintain a state of cognitive tension, a powerful force that propels you forward. And this is where discipline comes in. Discipline is the ability to delay not just gratification, but recognition. To hold the goal close without announcing it. To let the pressure of unspoken ambition build quietly in the background. Because that pressure keeps the task alive. It keeps the system primed. It keeps your nervous system aligned with effort, not expectation. The more you talk, the more you dissipate that energy. You release the steam from the pressure valve, and with it, you lose the force that drives real execution. There's also the phenomenon of ego reinforcement. When we speak about our goals, we often frame them in a way that supports our identity. We talk in terms of who we want to become, how we want to be seen, and the moment we receive verbal or nonverbal validation for that identity, our ego feels reinforced. The brain thinks we've arrived. It quiets down the systems responsible for urgency, effort, and attention. It becomes less likely to initiate action because the image has already been confirmed. Neurobiological standpoint, silence is a form of leverage. One of the most powerful tools you can use to accelerate personal growth, sharpen focus, and outmaneuver distractions. When used with intention, silence becomes a strategic amplifier. It doesn't mean you're doing nothing. It means you're doing more than people can see, and you're doing it with intensity that doesn't need to be broadcast. The human brain is wired to conserve energy and seek pattern. When we interact socially, the brain is constantly scanning for cues: who is leading, who is following, what threats exist, what status signals are being displayed. When you remain silent about your ambitions or your next move, you create ambiguity in those patterns. That ambiguity causes others to project their own assumptions onto you. In psychological terms, this is known as informational asymmetry. You control the narrative not by speaking, but by withholding. You introduce a variable that others can't predict, and that creates psychological tension, not in you, but in them. That tension is power. Let's shift the focus inward. Internally, silence helps construct mental architecture. When you refrain from announcing your plans or discussing your ideas before they're fully formed, your brain remains in building mode. It doesn't collapse into the comfort of recognition or applause. Instead, it keeps recruiting neural resources, problem solving, pattern recognition, visualization toward the internal structure you're developing. Silence allows those ideas to compound. The quiet gives you space to refine, iterate, and solidify your direction without dilution from outside opinions or premature feedback. Neuroscience tells us that the default mode network, a network in the brain active during self-referential thinking and introspection, becomes particularly engaged when we are silent, especially when we're not engaged in external tasks. This network plays a key role in visualizing the future, solving abstract problems, and forming long-term goals. When you're constantly talking, especially about yourself, your goals, or your next steps, you override that network with external stimuli. You replace depth with noise. But in silence, the default mode network activates more freely, enhancing your ability to connect dots that others miss. There's also the matter of cognitive sovereignty. When you operate in silence, you shield your thought process from contamination. You protect your mental real estate from outside influence. Every time you verbalize an idea, you open it up to interpretation, judgment, or discouragement. And even if no criticism is spoken, your brain picks up on micro signals, body language, tone, energy. These subtle cues register in your limbic system and can shape how you feel about your path. Silence keeps your direction insulated. It builds a wall between your intention and the world's reaction to it. Silence also plays a direct role in behavioral momentum. When you don't announce what you're doing, you remove the pressure of expectation and the drag of performance anxiety. This allows you to enter what athletes and researchers call flow states, deep, immersive periods of work where time disappears and execution becomes automatic. These states are highly sensitive to external noise. Talking too much about your work, even if it's with good intentions, can pull you out of that psychological rhythm. Silence, on the other hand, maintains mental continuity, making it easier to string together focused days without the interference of social optics. From a psychological warfare standpoint, silence builds an unspoken form of dominance. When people can't read you, they can't predict you. When they can't predict you, they can't control you. And in a competitive landscape, whether in business, athletics, creative fields, or personal development, that unpredictability is a massive advantage. It keeps others reactive while you remain proactive. You become the variable in the equation that no one can solve because they don't even know what question you're answering. And perhaps most importantly, silence teaches you to fall in love with the internal scoreboard, not the one the world sees, not the one people applaud, but the one you measure privately. There's a difference between public progress and private progress. Public progress looks like upward motion, new accomplishments, external validation, increased status. But private progress is internal. It's quiet. It happens when no one claps. It happens when you fail in isolation, recalibrate, and repeat. Private progress is when you show up and do the work precisely because you don't need to be seen doing it. That detachment from external feedback is not just emotional maturity, it's neurological efficiency. It keeps your dopamine loop closed. It means you're deriving motivation from the act of improvement itself rather than from recognition. Most of the brain's best work happens in non-linear spaces where input doesn't immediately produce output and progress can't be tracked by visible metrics. These spaces require patience and belief. Your nervous system needs time to consolidate what it's learning. The hippocampus and neocortex are working quietly in the background, integrating new patterns, pruning inefficient ones, and reshaping your internal models. This doesn't happen under pressure. It happens when there's space, silence, repetition. That's why mastery requires you to step away from the noise, to detach from optics, to spend more time training than performing. The quiet nature of mastery is not just about solitude, it's about focus. Attention is a limited resource. Your brain can't achieve deep learning if it's constantly switching contexts, responding to notifications, or worrying about perception. The attentional control networks in the brain, particularly the dorsal attention network, function best in environments free from distraction. When you're in silence, the signal-to-noise ratio in your brain improves. You can hear yourself think, you can notice the micro adjustments needed to refine your execution, and in that state, tiny improvements become exponential over time. Mastery also requires an emotional posture that doesn't need reinforcement. When you're dependent on praise to validate your process, you compromise the depth of your focus. You start performing instead of practicing. But real transformation is forged in psychological solitude. In the hours where it's just you, the task, and the quiet, demand to get better. It's in those hours that your identity begins to shift, not because someone told you you're improving, but because you feel it. In the way your timing adjusts, in the way your movement sharpens, in the way your mind stops overthinking and starts flowing. What you're doing in silence is constructing a foundation the world won't see until much later. And when that foundation is built properly, you don't need to talk about it. You don't need to prove anything because the results speak in a language louder than words: consistency, precision, and power under pressure. These are not the traits of someone who chased applause. These are the traits of someone who went quiet, someone who respected the slow grind of repetition, someone who understood that greatness grows in stillness, away from the performance and into the process. The pursuit of mastery is not linear, it's recursive. You loop back, revisit basics, refine what you thought was finished, and then refine again. This requires humility, a willingness to be bad again and again in the service of becoming great. And that humility is only sustainable when your process is rooted in internal drive, not external recognition. Because mastery doesn't reward speed, it rewards depth. And depth takes time, it takes stillness, it takes silence, the quiet hours when no one is watching. That scoreboard is honest. It doesn't care what you say, it only registers what you do. And the more time you spend in silence, the more attuned you become to that feedback loop. You stop chasing dopamine from applause and start earning it from progress. There's a law of nature and psychology that most people violate without even realizing it. In the early stages of anything meaningful, input must exceed output. In other words, you must absorb more than you express. You must learn more than you show. You must sharpen more than you swing. This is not just strategy, it's neurobiology. The brain isn't wired to produce excellence from scratch. It builds through layers, through pattern recognition, through immersive exposure to quality input. Let's break this down. The human brain is designed to model the environment before it attempts to manipulate it. The mirror neuron system, located in the premotor cortex, activates when you observe others performing an action. This is how babies learn to walk. This is how athletes learn to move. This is how artists, coders, thinkers, and creators develop intuition: by watching, by absorbing, by immersing themselves in high-quality input before they ever attempt to express something original. This biological truth applies across every domain. Whether you're building a business, learning a craft, or transforming your body, the early stages should be a period of intense intake. When you prematurely focus on output, on posting, promoting, publishing, showcasing, you interrupt the internal architecture of mastery. You start optimizing for visibility before you've built value. And here's what happens neurologically. The brain begins to associate effort with performance instead of development. That shift is dangerous. It rewires the nervous system to seek feedback too early, which short circuits the deep, focused learning required for high-level skill acquisition. Your brain stops asking, "What do I need to understand better?" and starts asking, "How will this be perceived?" You've now entered performative learning. It looks good from the outside, but it lacks durability. It collapses under pressure. Think about the hippocampus, a critical structure for learning and memory consolidation. In the early stages of any new pursuit, the hippocampus is working overtime, taking in new information, forming associations, testing predictions. That process is slow, effortful, and metabolically demanding. If you divert cognitive resources toward output too soon, you weaken the signal that says, "This matters. Keep storing, keep refining." You interrupt the wiring process before it completes. Your brain never gets the reps it needs to encode that knowledge into long-term usable skill. What you produce ends up being shallow, fragile, unstable. There's also a deep psychological cost to early output obsession. You create a false ceiling for yourself. When you start projecting your progress before it's real, you begin to shape your identity around early, undeveloped expressions of your work. This locks you in. It becomes harder to pivot, harder to evolve, harder to stay curious, because now your ego is tied to an output that was born before the foundation was fully built. You're no longer optimizing for learning, you're optimizing for consistency of image. An image does not make you effective, it just makes you visible. This is why the early stage of any transformation, mental, physical, creative, professional, must be built on input. Read obsessively, watch with intention, observe how the best in your field make decisions, study the micro patterns, deconstruct, reconstruct, internalize. Let the ideas of others collide and compress inside your mind until something unique begins to emerge organically. When you prioritize input, your brain begins to automatically synthesize and simulate. It builds mental models. Those models, once they become stable, are what allow you to produce with clarity, precision, and impact later. Delayed output is not procrastination, it's strategic incubation. It's creating space for depth to develop. You're not just collecting information, you're transforming how you think, how you see, how you interpret the world. And that transformation doesn't happen on stage. It happens in the lab, in solitude, in the quiet hours. It's not public, it's not shareable, but it's where the real leverage is built. Because once the internal system is strong, once the models are encoded, once the repetitions are there, the output comes fast, sharp, and undeniable. You don't have to over-explain it. You don't have to oversell it. It speaks for itself because it came from a place of real understanding, not rushed expression. That early silence, the one driven by intense input, is not a void, it's construction. It's laying cognitive, emotional, and behavioral infrastructure. The kind that doesn't collapse when pressure hits, the kind that scales, the kind that lasts. The human brain is an incredible organ, powerful, adaptive, capable of complex logic and high-level decision-making, but it's also vulnerable, especially when it comes to how we experience reward. Deep within the brain lies a system built to help us survive, evolve, and adapt. The reward circuit, anchored primarily in the ventral tegmental area, ETA, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. This system releases dopamine in response to actions and experiences that our brain interprets as valuable. That could mean solving a problem, hitting a target, or building something meaningful. But in the modern world, this system can be hijacked specifically by social approval. Dopamine is not a signal of success. It's a signal of anticipated reward. It doesn't mean you've made it, it means keep going. But here's the issue. The brain doesn't always differentiate between earned reward and perceived reward. When you post something online and it gets likes, when someone compliments your potential, when your idea is praised before it's executed, that praise generates a dopamine spike. It feels like progress. It feels like validation. It feels real, but it's not tied to any meaningful goal-directed action. It's simulated progress. And over time, that simulation rewires your motivation. So this is when we are actively rewired to something new, that we feel that volatility. The brain adapts to what it's exposed to most consistently. If your dopamine system starts to get its biggest hits from social validation, praise, followers, compliments, digital attention, then that becomes the new metric of success. Not learning, not building, not improving, but being seen. And once the brain gets used to this, it becomes harder to stay focused in private, harder to grind in silence, because the internal reward loop gets overridden by the external one. Let's break this down. In the early stages of any craft or pursuit, the work is invisible. There are no metrics, no applause, just friction. That's when the reward system should be most active, when you're stacking small wins, doing the reps, building capacity. But if you introduce social approval too early, you spike dopamine without the grind. The brain starts linking reward to exposure, not effort. This is a neurochemical bait and switch. You trick your nervous system into thinking you're progressing when in fact you've just changed the scoreboard. The prefrontal cortex, which handles decision-making and long-term planning, is especially sensitive to emotional feedback. Social approval triggers a release of oxytocin and dopamine, which signal safety and achievement. But if this happens too frequently without actual results behind it, your prefrontal cortex begins to shift its priorities. Instead of staying locked on meaningful goals, it gets pulled towards social optimization, crafting narratives, appearances, moments that earn instant validation. And the deeper that pattern goes, the harder it becomes to focus on deep work. Because deep work doesn't generate immediate praise. There's also a deeper cost to this hijack. You start needing external signals to feel confident in your trajectory. You start deferring to feedback instead of intuition. And when that feedback goes away, or worse, turns critical, you crash. Because your reward system was never built on your effort. It was built on their reaction. That creates volatility. That creates inconsistency. You feel productive when you're visible and unmotivated when you're not. This is a fragile way to operate. It doesn't scale. It doesn't sustain. The truth is, most of what matters in your life will be built in quiet phases. And your brain needs to know how to generate dopamine from private milestones. That means learning how to reward yourself for showing up, for improving, for solving a hard problem that no one saw. That means attaching dopamine to process, not just outcome, to execution, not just attention. When you learn to do that, you begin to take control of your own chemistry. You no longer rely on the environment to tell you if you're doing well. You can measure your own momentum. You can create your own drive. Social approval isn't evil. It's not inherently bad. The problem is that it's addictive, and it's designed to be. Platforms, algorithms, feedback loops, they all understand the brain's reward circuitry better than most people do. And if you're not careful, they will rewire you to chase applause instead of mastery. They will train you to be consistent in visibility, but inconsistent in growth. They will reward you for being liked, not being great. In the domain of high performance, whether in athletics, business, or creative pursuits, there's a principle that cuts through all the noise. Surprise beats expectation. Not just metaphorically, but neurobiologically. The human brain responds more powerfully to unexpected outcomes than to expected rewards. This response isn't just psychological, it's rooted in the architecture of your nervous system, particularly in how dopamine is deployed. When something exceeds your internal prediction, it doesn't just feel good, it wires in deeper. It commands attention, activates memory circuits, and drives behavior change far more effectively than any result you anticipate. Let's break this down from a neurobiological perspective. Dopamine is not a reward chemical. It's a prediction error signal. When you expect a reward and receive exactly what you predicted, the brain registers that moment, but it doesn't spike dopamine. You're just confirming a model. No new learning, no rewiring. But when the outcome exceeds expectation, when something surprising happens that